introduction. As Jessica said, I'm James O'Shaughnessy. I'm a partner and founder at New Market Strategy, which is a market access consultancy. And once upon a time, I was a politician and a minister in the Department for Health and Social Care, where we grappled with this very topic that we are going to be discussing today, and I regret to say did not solve it. So hopefully we'll go some way to doing that today. I'm delighted to be joined up by a slightly different lineup than you're seeing on the screen. Axel is still Axel. Will is Colin. Glasgow Airport was shut yesterday, so he couldn't join us. And unfortunately, Sarah has got this horrible bug that's going around and is unable to join us. So she sends her apologies. But nevertheless, I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion based around the perspectives of two people who are steeped in the idea and the importance of making sure that this new wave of digital therapeutics actually gets bought and used in our healthcare system for the benefit of patients, obviously, to relieve clinical workloads, and of course to drive economic growth. I personally find this an incredibly fascinating topic. These are things, digital therapeutics, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept, but they work like medicines, but they're regulated like medical devices, which puts them into difficult, interesting, novel, choose your adjective territory. And they demand a new approach to regulation and reimbursement that we simply don't yet have. Other countries are getting there. Germany, people may have heard of the DiGA system of reimbursement for Class 1 medical devices in Germany. It's not all plain sailing there, as Axel might bring to life, but they're doing well. The US as well, through the FDA, is looking at regulating digital therapeutics. Pear Therapeutics, I think, was the first out of the gate there. And of course, these are companies who produce these digital therapeutics are incredibly mobile. And so if we don't create a warm, welcoming atmosphere in this country for those companies and their products, then they will move, and they do move, to Berlin, to Boston, to San Francisco, to Paris, to you name it. And that of something is a brain, obviously we can't have that kind of brain drain. It's bad for everyone. So the big question we're going to be grappling with today is what we should do to make the most of this new wave of innovation and to attract all that foreign direct investment, to make the most of our homegrown companies rather than losing them elsewhere. And to join me in that discussion, we have two speakers. First of all, we have Will Goddard, who, as Jessica said, is the UK Managing Director for Big Health and is formerly a consultant at Teneo. We've also got Dr. Axel Heitmuller, who is the Managing Director of Imperial College Health Partners, the Director of Innovation at NHS Test and Trace previously, and Director of the Discover Now Real World Data Hub as part of HDR UK. So two brilliantly qualified people. And I can't remember who I asked to go first. Yeah. Was it you, Will?
I think it was.
It was. Will, over to you.
Fantastic. Is this on? It is. So, hi everyone. I'm Will Goddard. I'm Managing Director of Big Health, the company that made Sleepio. And some of you might know Sleepio as the first ever digital therapeutic to receive positive NICE guidance earlier this year. So I am at the same time very well qualified and also not at all qualified to talk about the topic of reimbursement, because while Sleepio has NICE guidance, we aren't yet reimbursed in England. So that's the kind of interest that we have, obviously, in solving this challenge here. And perhaps I can explain a little bit about Big Health's journey with the NHS. And before I do, kind of lay out three principles that I think are really important for developing a reimbursement model in England for digital therapeutics. So the first of those is the nature of digital therapeutics. The second is their value. And the third is their potential. And I'll come back to those as I kind of talk about our history. So you rewind all the way back to 2010. So we've been around for a long time. 2010, Big Health is founded by a clinical psychologist, Colin Espy, and a man living with insomnia, Peter Hames. And Peter can't get cognitive behavioral therapy through his GP, which is what you're meant to have for the treatment of insomnia. It's first-line recommended treatment from NICE. And Peter ultimately seeks out a book on CBT, self-administers a course of CBT, and is cured within 6 weeks. Not everyone has that experience, but Peter sought out the author of that book, which was Colin, tracked him down and said, can we digitize this so that everyone else can benefit from the care I've just benefited from? And Colin's reaction was, yes, fine, if it's safe and if it works. And so the first thing that they did after building Sleepio was to run a randomized control trial. So it wasn't a marketing campaign, they didn't give it out to a few people, see what happened. It was an RCT in which 76% of poor sleepers moved from unhealthy sleep to healthy sleep. And so that commitment to evidence has never really wavered. There are now 12 randomized controlled trials published on Sleepio, demonstrating its safety and its effectiveness. And that brings me to my first principle, which is, by their nature, digital therapeutics are treatments. And they need to be looked at in that way, evaluated in that way, and if they are to be reimbursed, held to the same high standards that we hold any pharmacological treatments to in the UK, because that's what we all expect as consumers of healthcare. And it's the way that NICE should be behaving in terms of a regulator. And so to complement that clinical evidence that we've developed, we've partnered with the NHS over a number of years to develop real-world evidence as well. So what is the impact of CPO in the real world implemented in NHS services, which, as we know, are not like the controlled setting of a clinical trial. And so we've worked with partners ranging from AHSNs, so Oxford AHSN principally, Wessex AHSN as well in North Hampshire, Innovate UK, the NHS Innovation Accelerator, Care City, and that real-world evidence has allowed us to demonstrate the impact that CPO has for the NHS, both clinically and in terms of its health economic base. And that brings me to my second point, which is value. So none of us would find it acceptable if you were given a treatment in a GP's practice where the treatment might work, where it might be safe. And so the same should be true of digital treatments. And at the same time, the NHS would never say, oh yeah, we'll spend taxpayers' money on something that might work or that might save us money. And none of us would want that either. That's not a good deal for the system. And so the way that reimbursement needs to work for digital therapeutics needs to reflect the value that they drive for the system, which brought us with Sleepio to the NICE Medical Technologies Evaluation Process. So that was the committee that we submitted to gain NICE guidance for Sleepio. And that committee looked at two things. They looked at the clinical value and the health economic value that Sleepio drove, and found that it's more clinically effective than standard of care and cost saving in year. And so what that meant was there's a very clear sort of demonstrable value to the system and to patients that CPO is driving. And from that, you can start making decisions about reimbursement. But I turn to the reimbursement landscape, and at the moment in England, regional reimbursement has been very difficult. You know, there's been huge changes to commissioning structures over the last few years, from primary care trusts to CCGs, STPs, ICSs, and what will come around the corner. And at the same time, I'm actually not sure that regional reimbursement meets my third criteria, which was the potential of digital therapeutics. So digital therapeutics are highly scalable and able to meet the level of need that we see across the country. They also provide a consistent patient experience, so they tie into themes like reducing unwarranted clinical variation to leveling up across the country. And really, this is an industry in its infancy. And so this is the right time, I think, for the NHS to be collaborating with industry and to really be shaping the face of this mental health service of the future. And indeed, that's what happens in Scotland. So in Scotland, Sleepio is reimbursed at national scale in partnership with the Scottish Government and NHS Scotland. And so really, our purpose at the moment is to level up that health inequality that now exists north and south of the border, where you have a patient in Dumfries and Galloway who can access Sleepio, and someone living in Northumberland who can't. And so that's why I'm advocating for this model that recognises those three principles of digital therapeutics and brings that to England effectively.
Thanks, Will. Incredibly clear getting those three principles across. You talked about Scotland. Of course, the UK is 4 NHSs, not one. You have been successful in achieving national commissioning in Scotland. Can you just bring to life the kind of nature of the discussion with the Scottish Health Service that actually led to that outcome and contrast it with what's happened in England so far?
So I think where Scotland started is that they had a very clear sense of the value of digital therapeutics for them. So they have a slightly different program in Scotland called the Computerised CBT program, but ultimately that has now expanded over time to include things that aren't necessarily just CBT. So it can include things like therapist-enabled digital interventions, as well as fully automated software solutions like Daylight and Sleepio. So Daylight is our other treatment for generalized anxiety disorder, by the way. Sleepio is for insomnia. And so I think they had a very clear sense of the value, and the value to them was being able to meet the scale of mental health demand while recognizing that face-to-face services would always have their place. And so Scotland had a very clear picture of where digital therapeutics fit into the existing clinical landscape, and where they essentially would go above and beyond what face-to-face services were able to deliver. And so I think that sense of where it fits in the system, so this is not about replacement or knocking out, this is where it fits and integrates in a system, meant the conversation started sort of 10 miles on from where it would have started with England, because that thinking hadn't yet been done.
Very good, and it's probably worth saying, it's tempting, isn't it, always especially sitting here in London, think of the NHS, think of England, but actually Scotland, Wales, even Northern Ireland can often move at greater speed, be more pro-innovation, and for anybody out there with a digital therapeutic wondering where to try and get your first kind of commercial traction, I think that lesson and other lessons would strongly encourage you to look broadly across the UK, not just at England.
Definitely.
Will, thank you very much. If you could pass the mic to Axel. Axel, you've got many perspectives on this, running an academic health science network and elsewhere. So it'd be great to hear how you think we can achieve this goal of reimbursement for digital.
Let's see whether we're going to get there. Hopefully you can hear me. I can barely hear myself in all this noise. So let's try. I will have sort of 3 very brief points in this space. And I think what connects them is the notion that reimbursement is important and necessary, but not sufficient. Right? So we talk a lot about the reimbursement, but in my view, that is not the whole of the story. And I think what you have just described, Will, sort of speaks to that. So the first one is, as James alluded to already, there has been a bit of a sort of natural experiment going on in Europe. Mainland Europe has had DiGA for a few years now. Germany started it, France is sort of catching up. Belgium has a reimbursement system as well. The UK doesn't, right? So the UK has a reimbursement system which is entirely local. So NICE may say this is a good product, but it doesn't mean that anyone is going to pay for it. It is down to, it was down to CCGs, is now down to ICSs. The truth is that things in the DiGA land have been interesting and more nuanced than maybe this sort of dichotomy suggests. So if you talk to people in Europe, they would say it takes a long time, which is a problem. It is not very predictable, so even if you get into the kind of scheme, you may be taken off again, and there are sort of a few examples where digital therapeutics have ended up in the DiGA system and they were prescribed, but they then have subsequently been withdrawn because the evidence wasn't forthcoming, because DiGA is, after all, only a conditional permission to actually be in the market. You have to then prove, you have a year to prove that your product actually works. So there's uncertainty about the continuity of care, which is not particularly great. And then I think the other, issue that I'm going to come back to is just having reimbursement doesn't mean that that you're getting prescribed and that you reach patients, which is a huge issue, which you're finding as well. So the DiGA is not necessarily the entire answer. In many ways, one of the other interesting bits about it, where I would say that actually the UK stands out compared to Europe, is the idea of the DiGA was that you have real-world evidence and that you use real-world evidence to prove that your product works. None of the products that are currently on the DiGA have used real-world evidence. All of them have used RCT studies, which is really interesting. So the whole experiment was about let's use real-world evidence, and suddenly we will be in a different world. That hasn't played out. And I would argue that the irony is that while Germany has a reimbursement system, it has no data, or data that can be used in a meaningful way to do real-world evidence. The UK has the data, but it hasn't got a reimbursement system. And somehow we need to bring this together. So that's point one. Point two is, even if you wanted to do real-world evidence, it costs money. And a lot of the companies in this space are relatively small, at least initially. They have seed funding and so on. But what we find is that a lot of the kind of investors are often not particularly interested in investing in evidence. Right? They're interested in all kinds of things, but actually finding funding, if you're a small company, to afford a real-world evidence study is quite tricky because they're not cheap, right? The products might appear cheap. It's an app. How can that possibly be particularly expensive compared to a drug? But the evidence that you need to generate is still pretty onerous and costs money. So who pays for that? It's the second point. So we may create the conditions for this, but it's actually the rest of the ecosystem geared up to that. And the final point is, I think, probably the most profound of the sort of challenges, which is these apps are a bit like cars. A car is pretty useless unless you actually have a road to travel on. And we haven't really built roads for these digital applications to travel on, right? So I think in Germany, I'm right to say that only 4% of clinicians are prescribing digital therapeutics. 4%. So the question is, how do you get this stuff to patients or even clinicians? Because how does it physically work, right? Does it sit on a computer system where you can just say, like a pill, I prescribe a digital therapeutic? No, you can't, right? are actually physicians the only way to get into the market? Because the beauty of digital, after all, is it's not like a pill, right? And in theory, anyone could prescribe it. You could give it to employers, and they could use it for their workforce. But for whatever reason, we're still sort of thinking very narrowly about the kind of routes and roads that we use to get these things into the market. There's obviously in the UK, there's a company called Okra that specializes in ways of building these kind of digital roads. That I think is a good example of someone who is not worried about the application, but is worried about how it can enable a market to function in a much better way. So those are sort of provocations, I suppose, for a discussion, which hopefully we're going to have.
Yeah, thanks, Axel. I just want to come back on one point which you made, which I think is really important, which you said reimbursement is necessary but not sufficient. But it also feels like it's a foundation stone in the sense that if it's absent, the rest of it isn't going to happen either. And that seems to be the experience with Sleepio in England. So if I can put you on the spot, given your experience, what do you think would be a good reimbursement program or scheme for digital therapeutics in England? What kind of shape would it have? Give us some ideas.
Yeah, so I think there's already the beginnings of a framework. Obviously, NICE has a kind of evidence framework. I think it needs further work. It is relatively limited. It doesn't deal with artificial intelligence. So there's some methodological issues that still need to be advanced. I think they can be overcome. Then I don't really see a reason why, if NICE says this stuff should be in the market and is safe, that it shouldn't be reimbursed nationally. Yeah. I mean, I can't really see any good reason for this not to happen. The only reason is affordability, in my view. So therefore, we need to have a conversation about how we trade this off. But after all the kind of loops that you had to go through to show that, I think I'm right to say that at least in the kind of long run, your product is more cost effective than some of the pills that get prescribed. So therefore, we have the answer, right? Either we believe that or we don't. So it's not really rocket science. I think there's more a kind of affordability issue that gets in the way.
Yes, and maybe, Will, you could bring that a bit to life with Sleepio, because NICE, you went through the NICE Pro, you did everything that was asked of you, and then you're kind of left hanging, even though the evidence shows that Sleepio would be cost-saving, not just value-generating, but actually cost-saving. It's completely nuts, right, not to pay for stuff that will save you money. So what, from a Sleepio point of view, you've been through that process, was it what you were expecting at the end of it, to be left hanging like this? What did you think was going to happen, and what would you like to happen?
I think it's worth saying that obviously this is the first time that a digital therapeutic has gone through a process with NICE. So it was groundbreaking. NICE maybe didn't, I would say both sides didn't quite know what it would look like at the end of it, but we did know what the recommendation would hopefully be, which would be that Sleepio would be recommended for use in a certain clinical setting, and there would be some sort of recommendation on its price. And because of the process that we went through, that was required to be cost-saving. So you have another process called a technology appraisal where you look at cost-effectiveness, and that might be that there's a significant outlay, but the NHS thinks it's worthwhile. With Sleepio, it is actually cost-saving for every person who starts treatment. And so that, to our mind, is a huge plus, particularly the conditions in which the NHS finds itself now. I think we weren't necessarily expecting to be left hanging, but I think at the same time, if you compare digital therapeutics to pharma, we were talking here about the hoops you have to jump through, and therefore the reimbursement almost just should be it shouldn't really be a debate that you should just be reimbursed, and you should be reimbursed at national scale. I think if you compare to pharma always know from the point at which they decide to invest in a molecule that there is this path at the end, and so the investment that they make in evidence generation is one that they make in the sound knowledge that if they do provide a clinical benefit, there will be reimbursement at the end of it. So I think I wouldn't say that from 2010, when Colin and Peter first founded the company, they knew, right, our end goal is NICE. They just knew that we were a treatment. Over time, they realized that, yes, the end goal for a treatment naturally should be NICE guidance. But I think we are at the moment struggling a little bit with the fact that I think that wasn't part of the grand plan.
Yeah.
And so now I think we're realizing, along with the system, along with NHS England, NICE, that the next logical step is national reimbursement, and that's what makes sense for a product with NICE guidance.
Yeah, and if Sarah had been here, she'd be telling us to think about the early value assessment program that NICE has created, which is a kind of conditional approval that would happen much more quickly than the MTEP process which you went through. The idea being that the system needs to move with much greater alacrity, particularly for digital, both in the nature of the product, but also actually the nature of the companies, which are not your typical pharma or medical device companies. They're not huge, have big balance sheets, have the patience of working with the system. Time is money for these VC-backed businesses, and they will move if it's not happening in a market. And I think that is one of the great risks that we have here. So hopefully that's got the conversation started. I want to go out and ask if there are any questions from the audience. Probably need to give somebody my microphone because it is kind of... Oh, Jessica, thank you so much. There's a chap at the back there.
Perfect, thank you. If you could just say your name and who your question is directed to, that would be fab.
Yeah, hi, I'm Francis from Adirium, and my question, really, any of you can pick who answers, but I see the dilemma, right? You go through all these layers of approvals, and if you've got medtech as well, you've got DTAC and other sort of CA, CE, and everything else. Who is it that is your point of contact? I think Sleepio to reach in NHS England to kind of bash the door down to say national reimbursement is a thing, because you're the pathfinder for digital therapeutics. That's very clear and it's well done, but it's quite a while now, And I was on the NHS Innovation Accelerator with Peter some years ago, and I wonder, what does it take to drive that point home, and is there a way of teaming up to sort of barge the door down in numbers, maybe?
Yeah, so I could maybe answer first, being from TPO. So you're right, it has been a while. And I think the thing that really has changed things is the NICE guidance. So I think that was the moment where we really found, and obviously, getting the NICE guidance was a year and a bit in the making. So it's not that suddenly we got NICE guidance having not done anything to get it. I think that was probably the point at which we really found our healthcare identity and our identity as a treatment. And that, I think, was the first element of pathfinding for the industry. This was saying that if you're a digital therapeutic, that's the path. And if you're in the wellness space, and there's a huge need for that within society, but it's different to being a treatment, then maybe you go the other way. And so I think that was the first bit of pathfinding, maybe the first sort of breadcrumb we left for the industry. I think the next bit, you're right, is with NHS England, and I can't say that we've solved that yet. But I think that the NICE guidance has focused minds on the need for there to be this logical next step. And I really like the way that you expressed that. It's the idea that with NICE guidance, the debate is sort of the debate changes and the debate is far more focused. Whereas I think pre being that pathfinder, you could have defined a digital therapeutic in a lot of different ways. And that actually wasn't, I don't think, helpful for the industry. But I don't know, Axel, if you...
Yeah, I mean, I would... Is it still working? Yeah. I would agree. I slightly controversially, I think the reimbursement is a bit of a red herring, right? If I had sort of to organize my time in terms of lobbying, I would put more effort into getting clinicians to understand that this stuff is even out there and that it works, because I think that the sort of basic level of understanding that these things are credible alternatives to some of the kind of pharmaceutical interventions is not there. So there's a whole infrastructure missing. You now have a nice central process and you have potentially local reimbursement, but I guarantee you that the level of awareness amongst patients and amongst clinicians is extremely low. And I think that is a much bigger battle to win. We haven't even won that in pharma, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that could be prescribed, but it is not being prescribed for a variety of reasons. So I would focus there, to be honest. I think the rest will come, but it's very difficult at this kind of particular moment, fiscally, I suppose.
Just to follow on Axel's point, I think, because you both said that reimbursement is part of the picture, but ultimately these are products that need to be prescribed, which means behavior change, which means people. And actually, I think there is a good success story if you look at the diabetes prevention program. I think in its early stages involved buying lots of licenses to sort of behavioral change services that went unused, but then there was a concerted effort to actually retrain the clinical community and effectively to make it easier to choose these things if you're a clinician, driven a lot by patient behaviour. So there are some good examples, I think, and the truth is they've all got to go together. the reimbursement with the behaviour change. I mean, I think there are also some very technical things that need to be addressed, like there being a national formulary for digital therapeutics, and those kind of things. As you say, Axel, we haven't solved that in medicines yet, where we have a proliferation of formularies and tenders and all the rest of it. But we do have the opportunity, I think, to do that, with sort of degree of novelty in digital therapeutics.
Awesome, thank you. All right, next question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name's Matt Prime. I'm from Roche. We're a large pharmaceutical diagnostic company. So I'd like to make 2 points. One is just to give a bit more information about what happens in Europe. So I think you talked about DIGA. There's a lot of work happening in Europe around connecting evidence standards to reimbursement. And actually the French, in France, they'll update DIGA and call it something called DIHA that will come out in 2023. And that will expand it away from just being digital therapeutics to what they call digital medicine. So that will cover reimbursement for telemonitoring, digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics. And it will also give an extended period of time instead of 12 months to get your real world evidence, you'll get potentially 24 months. And so there's a lot of opportunity in Europe. And I think generally companies from the UK tend to think of America, but Europe is also a very viable option. So one of the things that leads me to reflect on, as you can tell I'm from the United Kingdom, I'm actually based in Switzerland, is that I think this is harming our competitiveness in 2 ways. The first is the startups, which you talk about, but I'm the head of evidence generation for digital products at Roche. So I look after potentially 50 different products, from infrastructure products all the way up to AI image analytics tools. These ones need to be regulated. If I'm going to make an investment in doing some form of RCT, why would I do it in the UK when potentially if I go to France or Germany, I can scale across Europe, or if I go to the US and make that investment, I can scale across the US. So I think until we get this right, it's actually inhibiting our competitiveness in the UK.
And can I just ask a question back, Matt? So part of the answer why you would come to the UK is because we have better data assets than Europe at the moment, right? I take the point that the end point is a different one, but isn't that the kind of starting point that effectively we have actually a pretty good base? We have now to sort out the rest, which is potentially a more comfortable position to be in than Germany and France, which I'm not sure how much chance they stand to kind of unify some of the data assets that they have.
Yeah, I mean, we come to the UK because we get to work with you, Axel, which is fantastic.
Obviously.
But yeah, no, the UK has a strong advantage in its data assets, definitely. But there is the other things, right? Yes, we could make a product here, we could do some of the work here, but we can't get market here in the same way that I could get in Germany or in France or the US. So it's a bit of a balance as to how transferable is the evidence that you create in the UK to those other more those other faster moving markets. So yes, we have a lot of assets, but what we really need to do is connect the dots.
No, I completely agree. But I mean, from this discussion, is the sense that to me it feels a lot of progress has been made. There's a sort of 1 or 2 final steps that are missing, right? And this painful story probably will not repeat itself because you were pioneers and others, and you guys were very similar in that respect. So that is much better. What's missing is the formulary. What's missing is the kind of reimbursement. But I would still argue that, again, the other area where we could make faster progress is the dissemination as well, and the kind of working with actually the system.
And on that point, on distribution, I think we actually have a chance to look at what's happening around Europe and maybe think differently. So we've mentioned a lot on this panel about digital therapeutics being prescribed. I would challenge that. And if you look at the model that we have in Scotland, we have something called direct patient access, which is where someone can access a digital therapeutic from the comfort of their own home. So there's a lot of benefit there for sort of convenience for a patient. No need to drive for a GP appointment. No need to disclose that you're living with a mental health condition if you're living with stigma around that. At the same time, there's huge benefit for the clinical system. So you avoid GP appointments that don't need to happen. You bring care closer to people's homes, and typically they engage with it in higher levels. And so I think we have a chance across England to maybe think slightly differently to the way that DIGA does it, where I think in Germany and in other countries you have clinical care gate-kept in a clinical setting. And we have the chance to meet need where need arises, wherever that may be. And I think that plays into a few themes like improving health inequalities and levelling up across the UK that to me is just an opportunity sort of begging to be taken at this nascent point for the industry. This is the right time for the NHS to be saying, I see the opportunities here, rather than the complexity is too hard to surmount or confusing.
Can I just add one other angle? I mean, obviously agree with everything Axel will have said, but one other angle on this, which is having been a policymaker for about 20 years, would encourage you all, if you're not familiar with it, to go back and look at the digital health and care strategy that was published by NHS England in the summer. It was only 4 months ago, but I think it was at least 4 secretaries of state ago. So which is our new period of geological time. But there's a lot of really, really good stuff in there actually. And I think to Axel's point, there are causes for encouragement. There are also some big gaps that are still in there. And actually, I think collectively, if one of the things that people in this room and others who are associated with this industry can do, is to create pressure around the final missing pieces, as has been described, whether it's reimbursement, whether it's distribution, formulary change, or whatever it is, so that we really do have a best-in-class system. And I genuinely believe that if we do, that's very achievable. I don't think it would be very expensive, even with the reimbursement dimension. It would make us best in world, which actually is not that hard to achieve at the moment, because it's a growing field. And the consequences of that, Matt, to your point, would be tremendous in terms of inward investment, in terms of encouraging our own companies. Because Big Health has had to go to, you're very present in the States now, right? Because the UK has been harder. That shouldn't be what happens. So I actually think it's tantalisingly in reach. We need a bit of political stability probably and a bit of imagination to make it happen. But that's what everyone in this room can help create pressure to do.
Just to jump in on that,
oh, yeah.
I actually have a question. Sorry, to anyone else who does have one, I'll come to you in a second. And I think a lot of this conversation is really centered around the inertia that I think is felt across the industry, where clearly there is a lot of work that needs to be done at that policy level. So coming at it then from the innovators' point of view, people who are developing digital therapeutics and bringing digital therapeutics to market, while we're waiting for that, what should they be doing? Practically, where should they be focusing their energies, and what can they be doing to, whether it's initiate change, but also to get their solutions in the hands of the people who are going to benefit while we wait for reimbursement or indeed regulatory approval and that kind of thing? What should they be doing practically now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it sort of speaks to a point of pragmatism. So we've talked in sort of roughly ideal terms here that we don't think are too far away, but they are idealistic. So it's the idea that there is nationwide access to something that should be nationally available. There shouldn't be sort of pockets of access and pockets where people, just because of their postcode, can't access treatment. However, in trying to seed that innovation and demonstrating in the real world that there is impact, as well as existing as a business until such a point where you have the evidence that you can tip over into that ideal state, I think there are areas around the country that are ready to take up this innovation. So I mentioned a couple that we've worked with in the Thames Valley. Oxford HSN have been fantastic. Working in North Hampshire, CCG, and across the ICS there. So there are these areas, and to be honest, I would include Scotland in that as a country. They are very forward-thinking in this area. So I think sort of making the most of those pockets of innovation means that you don't have to wait for the ideal to sort of tip over. I think otherwise you get stuck in a binary world where you're right, you either do nothing or you do everything, and there has to be a middle ground as we're building there. And over time, I think that the job of the whole ecosystem, led by the NHS, led by politics, is to shorten that time where you're having to sort of just go around pockets of innovation and instead sort of make a clearer pathway such that you get more smoothly towards that ideal state. But I think, Axel, you've probably got a perspective across lots of providers.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we are thinking too narrowly about the NHS as the only kind of way into prescribing these things. Digital is beautiful because it's not tied to a particular delivery system. That's the whole point of digital, right? And I detect certainly, I mean, if you read the papers in the UK at the moment and you look at what's happening around productivity and the labor market and so on, and employers are starting to worry greatly about, sickness absence and so on. There's a shift in in I think, the attitude amongst employers to think more creatively about how they keep people healthy and in jobs and so on. And that's certainly a completely different route. You have described a third route, which is go directly to patients, and it's not always the NHS that has to pay for that. Local authorities, others could pay for that. We have to be more creative about the distribution routes, and I think that's what I would encourage people to do that are thinking about getting into the market at the moment.
Just one final thing to add to that. The thing that we notice most at Newmarket is people who don't collect the right evidence early enough. Of course you want to, it comes back to something you said, well, of course you need to demonstrate your clinical safety and effectiveness, not least to get your license, marketing authorization and so on. But ultimately, particularly with anything that might be designated as a device, it will be on your financial and health economic proposition. And people tend to leave that as an afterthought. Well, it works, clinicians love it, it will sell itself. It won't. You've got to collect that health economic data early, and because you will regret it if you don't. So to your point, Jessica, while we're still waiting for perfection, make sure you're getting great evidence very early on. Total no regrets decision. Have we got time for one more question?
We definitely do.
We definitely do. One more question, and then we'll wrap. Who would?
Come on, don't be shy. There must be another question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sophie from Helios. We do children and young people's mental health care. Seeing some nods. So I have a question off of the back of the reference of alternative distribution models and whether you think there's a risk to health equity or equity of healthcare if you have a large employer who's able to offer a tool that the NHS isn't able to offer, but actually the privileged few are related to that employer. What is that going to do in terms of our ability to distribute these tools that have an amazing capacity to generate equity of healthcare, but we kind of lose that in the distribution?
Yeah, I mean, so the answer is, there probably is, in the same way that with the whole digital agenda, people worry about age and, all kinds of other things. I guess what I'm saying is this doesn't have to be the only route, but why wouldn't we use it? Like, if employers wanted to do something for their staff, then we should enable them to do it. It's the responsibility of the state to worry about the kind of equity and kind of, distributional issues. I'm not saying let's not solve the kind of NHS problem in parallel, but let's not just wait for that. If there are other ways in which we can reach people, then we should, go down that route. And I do think if we really wanted to think about health, not just sickness care, then we have to think about other touch points that we have in society. And employment, I mean, we spend most of our time at employment, right? It's an obvious one for me, right? That doesn't preclude all the other things. And I don't think it has to solve the equity issue, right? It's a different purpose.
And I think the equity issue should be one that we are consistently trying to solve, and we never will solve fully because we will always discover another inequity somewhere else. And that should be, our goal should ultimately be to never think that we're finished. And so a couple of examples from our deployment in Scotland. We work very closely with primary care in Scotland. So we train GPs, social prescribers, or link workers as they're called in Scotland, practice nurses. But at the same time, we encourage them to say to their patients, look, if you can't access this at home, then your local library is going to be upskilled to be able to use their computers so that you can access Sleepio. So that's an example where you might think that because we're rolling out with the NHS rather than going straight to a large employer, we're kind of on safer ground. But there's always going to be an inequity that we find. And I mean, the largest one that we find at the moment is this binary inequity between Scotland and England, where there is access in Scotland, none in England. And so I would argue that that ideal should always be our end goal. Our end goal should always be, I think, for products that warrant it, national reimbursement, national distribution, and therefore national and equal uptake. In the period that there isn't that, I think it's probably better for us to try and get uptake where we can with that end goal in mind, rather than waiting for that moment, as I said before, where it sort of tips over. Because all the time that we're waiting at the moment, everyone in Scotland who needs help can access it, and no one in England can. And that's the I guess the drive behind Big Health as a company, is that isn't fair.
We have sadly come to time. I have a feeling this conversation could go on a lot longer. We have, if not solved the entire question of how to scale and reimburse digital therapeutics in the NHS, I definitely feel we're a bit closer than we were conceptually 45 minutes ago, and that's because of our fantastic speakers. So I'd be grateful if you could show your appreciation to Will and Axel. Thank you all for participating. And I do genuinely believe we are tantalisingly close to solving this problem. We can do that in the next couple of years. Thanks a lot. Bye.